Hello, everyone. My name is David Shullman. I'm the Senior Director of the Global China Hub here at the Atlantic Council. And on behalf of both the Global China Hub and Middle East program here at the Council, I am pleased to welcome you to our event today, investigating China's evolving role in the Middle East and North Africa, and launching the new Routledge Handbook on China-Middle East relations. There couldn't be a better time to launch this book. China has significantly ramped up its engagement in the Middle East in recent years, with major implications for the United States and for regional dynamics, global energy markets, and geopolitics. And just a couple of weeks ago, we saw further evidence that these dynamics will continue apace, with Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi holding talks with Gulf states, with Iran, and also with Turkey to expand ties across a range of areas. So it's an opportune time to launch this great book, and I believe that without a doubt, it will become the go-to resource to understanding this topic for years to come. And we're lucky to have the editor and really the leading voice on China's approach to the Middle East here with us, Dr. Jonathan Fulton, to talk about the book. Jonathan is a non-resident senior fellow with the Middle East program at the Atlantic Council. And in addition to editing this new volume, he has written two other books, China's Relations with the Gulf Monarchies, which he authored, and External Powers and the Gulf Monarchies, which he co-edited. Jonathan, welcome. I'll invite you now to give some opening remarks, and then we'll bring in the rest of our panel today to have a broader conversation about this topic. Over to you.
Great. Well, thanks, David. And thanks the whole team at the Atlantic Council. I really appreciate the chance for us to launch the book like this. And also thanks to my colleagues and friends, Dr. Xiaojin Chai and Lina Benabdallah, who are going to join us in a couple of minutes. It's interesting for me because usually big reference books like this don't get a book launch. They're expensive, they're heavy, but this is, as you said, it's the very definition of a timely issue. China, Middle East is just always in the news, and I think it really couldn't come at a better time. So I'll just talk a little bit about the what is it, how did I put it together, and why did we do it? What is it? Well, it's the deepest, most comprehensive look in English at China-Middle East relations so far. Touch wood, I think it'll, like you say, it should stay that way for a little while. And it's absolutely the dream team of specialists on this issue. It was so fun to put this together. Just writing to all these people whose work I've admired for years, people who I've looked up to, and write an email and say like, hey, would you be willing to write a chapter for this? And almost always getting positive responses. And I was just like such a fanboy. It was a really great experience. It's a very diverse set of contributors. We've got a lot of folks from the Middle East, broadly defined. We've got a lot of people from China, and we also have people like me who are from either, but are just genuinely interested in both. So it's a wide range of voices, and it's a pretty interesting approach because what you see typically in this type of thing is a lot of bilateral, descriptions of what certain countries are doing. And I think that's really important, but this was divided up into four approaches. There's kind of the big picture overview. Then there's a really great section on country and region specific case studies. There's a section on economic interactions, looking at things like tech, trade, energy. And then there's a section on more political and security focused issues. So really it covers the gamut. How did we do it? Well, I was sitting in Beijing in the fall of 2019, and I was just thinking like, what would I like to write about in China-Middle East relations? I did a report for the Atlantic Council in the spring of 2019 that kind of looked more broadly at China-Middle East. And as I started thinking about it and coming up with all these issues, I realized there's just so many stories that haven't been told about what's happening between China and the Middle East, North Africa. And in a lot of it, just I don't have the aptitude, the intelligence, the background, whatever, to write about tech, to write about these countries. So I'm sitting here in a park in Beijing, just kind of scribbling like, wouldn't it be awesome to get Lina to write about Algeria? Or wouldn't it be cool if, Xiaojin wrote about soft power? And I'm just kind of like scribbling notes. And it was really interesting because the next day I was actually at a conference and Lina was there and Tin Hanan Al-Kadi was there who wrote a chapter, and Sun Degong who wrote a chapter. And I think there were 4 people at this conference. And I just during the coffee break go up and say, hey, would you be interested in doing this? And everybody's like, yeah, that's interesting. And it just kind of gradually expanded into a bigger project. And the why of it, and this is the last thing I'll say until we and let them go to the questions. Obviously, kind of like as you said in the opening remarks, China-Middle East relations it's a very important geopolitical and geocultural shift. You see states and societies and markets across Eurasia, across the Indian Ocean region are integrating more deeply these days. It's creating a lot of new international political and economic dynamics that really haven't been studied enough, and they need to be better understood. And when we bring China into the conversation, as you know, being based in DC, China is a very polarizing topic these days across a lot of countries. And it's also something that I think is very misunderstood and heavily politicized. And when you bring into the equation countries in the Middle East, which are often, US allies and partners or US enemies, then it becomes even more politicized. And that's why a book like this, I think, is important, because it helps people understand these issues in a deeper and I think more meaningful way, rather than just kind of politicizing it and trying to score points. So I hope that folks in policy and academic communities and business community and general interested readers will find something here that will help them learn something about an issue I think is really, really fascinating.
That's great. Well, it truly is a comprehensive book on this really important topic, and covers every possible angle to this issue that you could want. So it's great to have this as a resource now, and to have this conversation about some of the conclusions and about what you and the panelists will bring in just a second have to think about this as well. Before I do that, I want to note for the audience, we will try to make time for questions at the end. So if you have any questions, please do put them in the chat as we proceed, and we'll try to get to those at the end. And now, as Jonathan was saying, we have two great panelists who are authors of chapters in the book, Dr. Lina Benabdallah and Dr. Xiaojun Cai. So I'd like to introduce them now. Lina is an assistant professor of politics and international affairs at Wake Forest University, and she has recently published a book entitled Shaping the Future of Power, Knowledge Production and Network Building in China-Africa Relations. And Xiaojun is assistant professor in the Department of International Relations at the University of Sharjah in the UAE. He's also been a senior research fellow at the Ministry of Culture, Youth, and Community Development in Dubai, and has taught and given lectures across universities in the UAE and in China at Beijing Foreign Studies University. So it's great to have the both of you with us as well. And so I'll start with just a general question for the panel related to this topic. And you can take it in any direction that you like, but it's about how both sides in this equation perceive each other. Where does the Middle East factor into China's strategic thinking, and how has that changed in your estimation in recent years? Is it still primarily about energy, or are there a number of other factors that are increasingly at play? And where does China now fit in strategic thinking in Middle Eastern countries, generally speaking? And I know there's actually a chapter about this in the book, with the understanding that, of course, there'll be differences across countries. But I'm curious if you have a sense that the Middle Eastern sense of China's role in their foreign policy and their strategy has also shifted. So I'll open that up to anyone who wants to answer first.
Well, I mean, I can give some idea, but I think it'd be better if Xiaojun can speak to China's interests, and I think Lina would be great to speak on Middle East. So, I think let's leave it to them.
Okay, thank you for Atlantic Council, and thank you, Jonathan, for launching this great book. Congratulations again. So regarding to the question about how Middle East fit into China's overall strategic thinking or plan, let's put it this way. For quite a long time, until very recently, China has seen Middle East as a region of very far and not like at the core of its strategy. I remember back just exactly 10 years ago, I was at Tsinghua University attending World Peace Forum. This is a very high level forum organized by the university, and normally the vice president or vice premier will give opening remarks. So Xi Jinping has been giving remarks to this forum, and I spoke with a few, China international strategists, like strategies covering American, Europe, and the whole world, not just Middle East. They all said look, even Americans cannot handle Middle East very well. Why you expect China to do something? So that's the 10 years ago. I still remember the exact word they said. But now, look at now, 10 years now, things has been changing, if not fully changed. We've seen China see Middle East or relations with the Middle East from transactional, more moving toward strategic. So this is in particular obvious in the context of U.S.-China rivalry. Middle East appear to be where both China and USA, especially from China's strategic thinking, it can be an area of leverage, the area of find the potential areas of cooperation or areas of competition. In addition to the traditional role, Middle Eastern being all energy supply, market for Chinese product, service, to have Chinese infrastructure capabilities, industrial capabilities to have a place. Now it's become a strategic area for China. So China are still not 100%, let's see, had a very clear Middle Eastern strategy to see. I've spoken with a few retired former officials from Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and even just before COVID. And I said, like, what now? So because for many years, especially after Xi Jinping took over since 2012, there was this big favor that, oh, Belt and Road and building all these things. So it looks like China has a very a great interest in moving toward Middle East and even Africa and beyond. But there's no clear strategy, like what strategy China is trying to do with Middle Eastern or Middle Eastern countries. Normally, people would say, oh yeah, China took a neutral stance, China is equal distance to everybody, China is friend with Iran, friend with GCC, friend with Israel, friend with Turkey, China will be good with everyone. The question is always, it's very difficult to maintain that neutrality and that balance with the increasing complexity in the region. Now, especially during COVID, China become more active, if not assertive, to pursue, to formulate its strategies. As I mentioned in my chapter, actually, in addition to safeguard the energy security and the maritime security of its energy supplies, China also are doing many other things. So one thing I noticed, like, again, this is, you see from as the part of the paradigm shift with the whole Chinese soft power building. So back before Xi Jinping or back before 2017, we see China's effort for soft power in the whole world and including the Middle East is more like to counter the so-called Western narrative against China, the Western smearing, of China, like to present the true Chinese image, true Chinese story, and have a Chinese voice. So just basically, it's more defensive. Like, oh, you said China is autocratic, China is human rights is bad, China is doing that. So China will come that, no, we didn't do that. So that's the effort of Chinese soft power building. But that has changed, I think, at least 5 years ago. Now China is more says, okay, not only we need to denounce or counter the Western narrative, we need to present our own story, our own image, and we have to be more very confident. So Xi Jinping proposed these 4 confidences. We have to be confident of our ideology, our theory, our approach, our system, etc., etc. So not only just Chinese culture is not only promoted in terms of there's a Chinese characters, Confucian Institute language, and that's part of it. But more the Chinese story of a successful building a socialist country, Chinese story of good governance. So as you see, in many Middle Eastern book fairs, the one top, the most featured book is not our book, China, Middle Eastern relations, this Routledge book has, of course, right? One book featured most, you know what? You guys, which one? The Xi Jinping's book, it's translated into Arabic and of course many languages. The Xi Jinping's thought on how to govern. I think that's the roughly translation of the title of the book. It's featured in many book fairs. So, and in the last 2 years, China's story of a successful beat or controlling COVID, or better than controlling the other countries, often featured in many news and many open-end opinion pieces by the Chinese diplomats. So all this shows, Middle Eastern has become much more and more interest in terms of both strategic and economic and even culture and ideologically toward China.
I'd like to add a few points to that, but I want to start by thanking first the Atlantic Council for hosting us, and thank you to Jonathan for the invitation and for the opportunity to be part of this really amazing handbook. I wanted to, like Africa, the Middle East is also a big place. It's a very diverse place, and so it's sometimes difficult to speak about the whole, region, MENA region in one kind of brush. So I'll make most of my remarks about the Maghreb, and in responding to the question of what China means and how China fits into the politics or the agenda in Maghreb countries. I think it would be complementary to what my colleague Professor Chai was just saying about about the investments in infrastructure. Governments in the Maghreb tend to view China mostly as an alternative partner that can provide opportunities for investments, for infrastructure construction, and for basically doing development differently from the partners that are more or less viewed as traditional partners of the Maghreb, including European Union and European Union countries. And so I think in providing that alternative, so viewing China as an alternative is a good way to think about how China fits into the politics in at least in the Maghreb and in North Africa and the North Africa part of the MENA. And this alternative is important at the level of investments. It's also important at the level of trade. I mean, China is the largest trading partner of Maghreb countries. So the relationship there is really important for the Maghreb side. Of course, we know that there are acute trade deficits, and so we know as well that Maghreb countries, for example, are not don't figure very prominently in terms of China's priorities for trade, but the other way around is actually the case. China is the largest trading partner of these countries, and so it is an important relationship there as well. But also politically speaking and diplomatically speaking, so Maghreb countries, and in my chapter I wrote about China-Algeria relations and how basically we can trace a very strong relational power dimension to China-Algeria relations going back all the way to the 1950s and standing through the COVID pandemic into showing basically acts of solidarity, acts and discourse and performing the discourse of solidarity between the two countries and showing that historical advantage that China has in terms of being a country that has been present in terms of diplomatic relations with anti-colonial, histories of anti-colonial revolutionary movements in North Africa, in Africa in general, but in this case, particularly in the Maghreb, from the beginning, and continuing that discourse of solidarity, continuing the discourse of being a partner of these countries and not necessarily a charity or a donor country or a kind of a relationship of hierarchy that is typically, that typically characterizes some of these countries' relations to their traditional partners in the European Union. So I would say alternative is basically the big way that I view how China fits into the politics of Maghreb countries. And then, of course, we can also speak about the Belt and Road Initiative also presenting this alternative or materializing on what the alternative can look like. And so here we have a country, for example, like Morocco, which is really playing up its geographical, the geostrategic positionality of Morocco being sort of at this kind of really as a link between Sub-Saharan Africa and Europe, North Africa, and then also the Atlantic Ocean as well, and really trying to bank on investments through the Belt and Road Initiative to present Morocco with alternative possibilities for development, for economic prosperity.
Thanks, Lina and Xiaojun. To build on what you were just saying there, Lina, and to some degree what you said, Xiaojun, as well. China is, as Lina was saying, the regions, the Maghreb, but also the Middle East generally is the largest trading partner, energy buyer. In these latest Middle East country meetings we just had with Wang Yi, they're talking about continuing to press ahead with economic engagement and a free trade agreement with the GCC. But and Lina, you kind of touched on the political side of things a little bit, but the political and security engagement from China with the Middle East and with North Africa does remain relatively, much less than the economic engagement and far behind that of the United States. So, I'm curious, for all of you, do you foresee that changing anytime soon? What are the limitations on China developing ties in those domains? What are the things that might push it forward? What's the role of the regime type and the fact that an authoritarian China is engaging with like-minded in some ways regimes in much of this region? So kind of open that up to you. Do you see the political security dynamic and the relationships developing more in the future?
Yeah, if I can jump in here for just a couple of minutes, I think Xiaojun's comments are pretty good. Weather vane for this. You're seeing China is becoming more and more assertive in presenting itself as more than an economic actor, political actor and potentially security. I think in the past, it's more modest engagement in those areas was a strategic choice, that the US was the guarantor of security or, was the dominant actor across the region in a lot of areas. And that status quo that the US, reinforced worked in China's interests. And not just China, right? A lot of countries that did business or got contracts or got energy from the Middle East were all quite happy to bandwagon or free ride under this US-led order. And when countries like India or Japan or Korea or the UK or the EU or whatever took advantage of it, it didn't really make a difference because they were US allies or partners. When China did it, it was a free rider, and then it was a little more contentious. I think the issue was the expectation. I think when you saw all of these, decades of U.S. officials saying, "Wither China, become a responsible stakeholder, get more involved in securing the shipping lanes and things like this," it was kind of put forward in a way that China would support this U.S.-led preference for how the region would work. And I don't think that necessarily was how China wanted to engage it. So it kind of took a more modest approach, but I think it did that because it didn't want to antagonize Washington because it had a pretty good deal as it was. And I think you can point to the past 5 or 6 years where the China-US relationship has really deteriorated. I think the trade war really politicized or weaponized rather this type of engagement. That trade is such an important part of China's regional presence, and when there's a trade war that makes it harder for Chinese companies or military or whatever to access the region, I think that Beijing's probably adopted a different logic where they thought we have to take a bigger role here. We can't rely on America to supply this stuff and let us have it for nothing. We have to start articulating our own approach. And you see that when Wang Yi gave his remarks last week when all the foreign ministers left, he gave, I thought, a really telling press conference where he said, the Middle East is Middle Eastern people are the masters of the Middle East. They don't need a foreign patriarch. There's no power vacuum. He was really going out of his way to articulate a different approach to the region. And so you see China starting to engage on that. And I think right now it's still small steps. things like, helping the Saudis with the domestic ballistic missile program, or maybe engaging with the UAE in whatever this installation was meant to be. Still small steps, but I think gradually we're going to see China playing a more robust role in those areas.
I would like to add to what just Jonathan said. So in terms of a political scenario, there was this speculation that, okay, China is happy to, come to, to invest without any ideological baggage, does not interfere with domestic politics. The many autocrats, the dictatorships would like this kind of approach. So you care about development, does not care about democracy. That's, I think, still a dominant approach of China is dealing with the Middle Eastern countries. But increasingly, again, we have to put this in the context of great power competition. There was this effort by China to counter or to offset the American effort in the last 10, 12 months to portray China as, authoritarian, which this factor becomes so much, disrupting between U.S.-China relations. China want to avoid China being portrayed as, as the role of the Soviet Union during the Cold War, like, oh, this is a, communist dictator. And so China made some effort to try to counter that message by hosting some conferences, some talks, and publishing some statements, and including also try to invite the Middle Eastern political elites to speak. So they'll see, democracy is not just owned by the USA or by the West, it's owned by many, any civilization, whether Chinese civilization, Confucian civilization, Islamic civilization, Arab civilization, East, West, they have their own special version of a democracy. So don't portray us, we Chinese or we Easterners are not democratic. So there is this effort to try to counter what you call this political messaging. In terms of a security regime, lastly, I agree with Jonathan, mostly. China is happy to say, okay, we with the US providing security umbrella in the region, and China get good deals, and you don't have to take much responsibility. That would not change, I think, in the near future. As I see, China is unwilling and even unable, let's say, to provide a comprehensive overall security framework for the whole region, as US is doing now. Even recently there's a lot of a report saying, oh, China is building some Navy port here and helping to develop a missile program with Saudi, and maybe it has more other military or security footprint somewhere here and there. But I think these are still limited, and mainly is focused on to protect Chinese infrastructure projects and to keep the maritime security, and somehow also to do with anti-piracy, if any. So maximum China want to avoid, to be like the title of today's talk, entangled, to the situation in the Middle East. I think that's still true, in the near future.
I agree. I just want to add just maybe a few points to say that in mostly from a theoretical perspective, as academics, we observe China's evolving security and military kind of policies and diplomacy in the region. It's always interesting to understand basically how China approaches security and what counts, and how, and a lot of it is actually mingling and mixing security and development, and looking at economic opportunities as sometimes a gateway to expand into security. So the two are related oftentimes. So where it begins sort of as more economic investments, that sometimes paves the way to more justifications and need for more security presence, and the other way around as well. So security is often defined in terms of development, and the other way around as well. So it's important to understand sort of the approach to see where it's coming from in that way. But also in terms of the future, it is probably interesting to think about it in terms of kind of the Belt and Road Initiative, and think about it both in terms of the maritime and the land routes, and how security is going to feature more prominently moving forward as more and more projects at the Belt and Road take shape, and then the need to secure the investments and need to secure the way forward, and also to stabilize, right, for these investments to be profitable, for them to work, then there needs to be a certain level of stability. So more and more this question of security is going to be at the forefront of the Belt and the success of the Belt and Road Initiative.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, Lina. And the kind of China's professed non-interference policy, and whether they'll be able to hold to that to some degree as their interests expand in this region and globally, as most rising great powers kind of security interests tend to follow their economic interests. I want to turn back to what some of what Xiaojin was raising, and Lina, you as well, about the soft power piece and China's narrative in the region and also more broadly. Lina, you've written a lot on China's soft power in sub-Saharan Africa, and for this book, of course, you focus on Algeria. There are differences across countries, but I'm curious if you find unique characteristics to China's approach to soft power in this region broadly and in the Maghreb specifically, particularly in comparison to what you've seen in sub-Saharan Africa, and what, if so, what you attribute that to. And then Xiaojin, as you mentioned, you write in your chapter about China's soft power in the region. You write about how state-run media has used billions of dollars to try to improve China's image globally. And in many countries, that campaign and also engagement with academia and with elites and others involves not just promoting China's image, but as you noted earlier, and I think this is still the case, kind of actively looking to minimize critical discussion about China that might emerge about the Belt and Road Initiative, about other Chinese policies. So I wanted to ask you, as China ramps up the soft power campaign you described in this region, how would you describe popular perceptions of China in the Middle East? How diverse are the sources of news on China available in the region? And does the nature of the political systems and media independence in this region, or lack thereof, mean that China can take a somewhat different or less proactive, aggressive approach to shaping the debate than it might elsewhere? So I'll open that up to either one of you.
I can start. So in the chapter I wrote for the book, I observe kind of an interesting paradox or an interesting puzzle. When I look at the narrative of government to government soft power, or the relation, the perception of China and China-Algeria relations at the level of government, it's interesting to observe that throughout the many different administrations and regimes, it has been a constant that China-Algeria relations are framed in terms of socialist friendship, in terms of anti-colonial struggle, in terms of these very strong words for friendship. So this includes post-Hirak and the new regime. This includes 20 years almost of Bouteflika regime, and sort of how throughout the many regime changes, the one constant was that in terms of discourse with China, the relationship has been essentially constantly framed in language of friendship. The other bit of this is the Arab Barometer surveys from summer 2020 came out with surveys, and the results were quite interesting. About 36% of Algerians, only 36% of Algerians surveyed in the Arab Barometer were interested in seeing stronger relations between China and Algeria. And so basically Algeria ranked last or among the kind of in the bottom of countries in terms of people's perceptions of the relations of their country with China. And so this is really interesting because at the level of the government, we see a very different picture from if we break it down to the level of people, to the level of the citizens. And so the Arab Barometer surveys showed that where Algeria ranked very low compared to Algeria being sort of holding since 2014 the highest strategic cooperation status with China among all the Maghreb countries. And so it was quite interesting to see that disparity, the disparity between the government to government level and then the people's perception. But the other aspect of how this is also interesting is that Africa remains the continent where China has the strongest set of perceptions, of people perceptions. China is always very positively regarded in Afrobarometer surveys and in these people perception surveys. But of course, the results from Algeria also contrast the rest of the continent. And it kind of really tells us, it shows us that when it comes to looking at perceptions, we are dealing with two levels. We're dealing with a sort of a government to government level, and then we're dealing with the population level. And so that's always really interesting to see how sometimes the two don't necessarily align. And it's interesting. It's a little bit challenging, of course, in terms of North African countries or in terms of the MENA region. My interest is in the Maghreb as it fits in the African continent. Why the difference? And a lot of that could be attributed to, of course, to language differences, to cultural differences. Algeria until today does not have a Confucius Institute. And Confucius Institutes open up sort of an institutional opportunity for more learning, across cultural learning and knowledge of the other. So not a lot of, regular citizen Algerians know a lot about China. That's still, there's a big gap of knowledge. And what gets trickled in and filtered in is sometimes through media that people watch. In Algeria, for example, it will be your French media, for instance. And so what gets filtered through French media sometimes has an impact as well. Although, of course, some of these outlets are changing as well, and there are opportunities for social media to come in and present different alternatives, and people are making a difference in a lot of these ways. But overall, the picture is that there is still a big gap of China among the regular population, and not at the government level. So I think that that just should provide sort of an example of maybe why we see lower kind of perception, of positive perceptions of China in the Maghreb countries as compared to others. But I'll let my colleagues weigh on this one as well.
Thank you, Lina. Jonathan, you want to speak or? Okay, so in terms of David's question, let me put it in two parts. First part is see how, again, China is trying to send in the message. What's the message of China? And then how the message was received in the Middle Eastern countries in particular. So as I said, since Xi Jinping started ruling China, this approach to the soft power or approach to present China to the world has some become more active or assertive. There are three lines here. First of all, as Lina just mentioned, to revive the old socialist affinities. Actually, not only I've met a few high officials from Beijing. They visit UAE and Morocco, Algeria, and many countries. And whenever they visit, they bring out this old, relations during the Mao era, how the friendship was during that time. And as you may saw the news, China has, under the Xi Jinping, has hosted quite a few times the World Political Party conferences. And also China, in particular, China hosts one conference specifically with the Middle Eastern political parties, most of the left-wing communist parties or populist parties, in terms of XinJiang Uyghur issue. So just to China try to present its own version of that that province. So as you see, this is the first line, try to revive the socialist communism, populist in left-wing scenario of the messaging. Second one is more to do with present China as a Eastern Asia Confucian civilization, which in dialogue or mutual learning with Arab Islamic civilizations. I organized quite a few this kind of a civilization when I'm working for the ministry. And so this, I think, is to see, so Chinese civilization or Islamic civilization, Arab civilization is different from the West. So we have the right to choose our ideology, our approach, and our political system. And lastly, is about this developmentalism or development approach that China and the Middle Eastern countries are all developing countries. They all facing the task of to pursue economic prosperity, and rather than pursue democracy and civil liberties, but development. Economic prosperity is priority. So this is China trying to sell its own version that, see, what we did in the last 30, 40 years. We developed the economy first. We, then we think about other issues. So this could be very popular. I think I talked to my students, young Emirati students, they all say, see, look at what Arab Spring, we are kind of failed in this pursuit. And we didn't achieve democracy. We didn't pursue what promised. And rather we got into civil wars and destructions. So look at China could provide alternative approach. Now, in terms of perception, Lina mentioned a few, surveys and parameters. Yeah, I also look at them. I saw during my research. So I look at Pew Research, Pew Center for Research about this public opinion toward China from both Western democracies and other developing countries. And I look at Arab parameters. And also I look at Arab youth survey and some local and small scale surveys. The general trend is that China's image has been increasing positively. Yeah. So there's a few countries like Lebanon, Jordan, and they have seen China much, much favorable than most favored country, even more than USA. And if you can trust, this surveys, including the Arab youth survey, I remembered is in 2020, is that so China ranked higher than the USA in Gulf countries. I think it's kind of rare or shocking, if not disappointing. I mean, so this is let's see how, considering the close ties, security ties, military ties between GCC countries and with USA, how come China is favored more? Maybe there's something to do with regional development. As I said, Arab Spring could be one, and also the problem with Iran, right? So which they see USA was not doing enough to helping the GCC country. Maybe wrong speculation. I really don't have confidence in this claim. But this is in terms of perception. You see the increasing Chinese positivity in the region. Even though, let's see, I look at the last 2 years during COVID, there was a lot of twists or changes, and some countries observed negative reporting and portrait of China, and it's very in the beginning of the COVID-19 in Wuhan. And in fact, China, of course, launched a big campaign globally and mobilized many media resources and PR resources to counter this negative reporting of China. And so I was asked to they asked, okay, do you observe any social media or popular media portray China in a negative way? In what way? So I observed them and I write a report, analyzed how it happened. So through this research, I found out that there's this, just David mentioned about this media freedom thing, So many countries, if this country has a good relations or strategic relations, if their leaders has good relations with Xi Jinping, now if the media actually cannot really portray China very negatively, and they cannot go, even there's a negative report, it will be, removed very soon. In those media-free countries, even relatively free, let's say Tunis and Turkey, and then you see, and Israel, you see much more negative reporting and image of China. So maybe there's this bias, in terms of regime type, in terms of media freedom thing. That's why you see China is portrayed positively. So it's remain to be seen. But the general trend, I believe it's true that China is
Oh, did you freeze? I think Xiaojun, you froze, but I think you were wrapping up. Oh, you're back. Did you? Anyway, I think you're back, but I think it was a great intervention. And, I think this notion of in countries where the media is less free, China's kind of, as some have put it, pushing on an open door in terms of trying to push its narrative when it has relationships with friendly countries, often less democratic countries. It doesn't need to do that very much because the countries have a good control over the media space themselves, or the regimes do. I wanted to turn to a question for Jonathan. There's, as you know, mounting focus in the U.S. and Europe and elsewhere on China's well-documented human rights abuses against the Uyghur population and other predominantly Muslim ethnic groups in XinJiang. And we had a question from Elizabeth McCune about, have any Arab countries criticized China over its treatment of Uyghurs? And I would add to that, I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, but in a lot of countries, we don't see just silence, but we see endorsement of China's practices, and some countries even detaining and deporting Uyghurs at China's request. So there are a lot of factors at play here potentially, but I'm curious what you see as driving this dynamic, and is there any possibility or likelihood of change?
Right. So yeah, this is always a really sensitive one. And I think that a lot of folks in the West expect this to be a bigger wedge issue between, Middle East countries and China than it is. It really hasn't proven to be much of one yet. That could partly be, related to issues that Xiaojun was just talking about. In a lot of countries where the media is less open, countries that have good relations with China don't report on that very much. And I think in a lot of places, publics don't really hear a lot about the Uyghur situation unless they actively go looking for it in international media. I think there are a lot of bigger, more, and again, take this with a grain of salt, because as a non-Muslim, non-Middle Easterner, I'm just looking at it and trying to make assumptions. But I think China's done, I think, a pretty good, effective job in framing their approach in XinJiang as an approach to an ideology that threatens state stability. When Middle East leaders are talking to Chinese leaders about what's happening there, it's often being framed as a response to a separatist or sometimes a terrorist ideology that wants to create a different state with a separatist movement. And it's often framed as a political Islamic leaning ideology. And of course, that resonates with a lot of leaders in the region, because they also have pretty strong feelings against that, because a lot of political Islamic groups are seen as competitors to governments in the region. So when they hear Chinese leaders say, look, this is our response to an ideology that threatens state stability, I think that resonates. So that could be one factor. I think another factor is that, there is a lot of competition within the region, and Turkey and a lot of Sunni countries have had pretty bad relations in recent years, especially since the Arab Spring. The Uyghurs are ethnically Turkic people. So, often it's easy just to say, look, this is Turkey's problem. Why aren't they doing more about it? You have seen, for example, that Turkey's foreign minister did say something negative about China's treatment of the Uyghurs in 2019, but then when President Erdogan went to China, they released a statement saying, he has heard our rationale and he's agreed to it. And, the Turkish government didn't, release a response that contradicted that. So it seems like he was willing to maybe accept that. And then there's another issue, which I'm not sure of, but I just assume that there is, I think a lot of countries around the world have seen what happens when you push China on these core domestic interests, things like XinJiang, Tibet, Taiwan, or Hong Kong, or issuing a Nobel Peace Prize to Liu Xiaobo, or any number of issues that China sees as, contrary to the domestic political stability. The Middle East hasn't really seen the coercive side of China's economic statecraft yet, because it's not really a core interest for China or for Middle Eastern countries. It's seen as, win-win cooperation on both sides, because they don't really bump up against each other's core interests. But if Middle Eastern countries were to start pushing back on these domestic political hot buttons, I think that would probably change pretty quickly. So you would see a pretty substantial cost with very little gain, because these aren't things that really resonate here, because people aren't talking about it, hearing about it, and people don't really relate to the issue the way that I think Western countries expect them to. I know that it's being used, it has been used as a wedge issue, but it just hasn't worked. So, I don't think that's going to change anytime soon.
Okay, thank you. We perhaps would turn to Iran now, which we haven't talked too much about at this point. We have a couple of audience questions about where Iran fits in terms of priorities for China. How we expect China to approach the talks around coming back on JCPOA, and also about this new 25-year cooperation agreement signed between Iran and China, which apparently, as of a couple of weeks ago now, has entered the implementation stage, and much has been made of that. So I'll ask anyone who wants to comment. How should we understand China's approach to Iran generally, and also to these developments that we've seen recently?
I'll jump in because I just recently published an article in Middle East Policy about China's approach to the Gulf region. I know that, again, whenever you talk about China and or Iran, you're going to push a lot of buttons in Washington. And the news about this, 25-year strategic partnership seemed to get a lot of people pretty worried. There's a lot of, I think, hype, talks about $400 billion in investment, which is just frankly ridiculous and impossible. Talks about China getting a base in Iran, which is also constitutionally prohibited in Iran. So also a lot of this stuff is being leaked out of Iran. And I think that was, again, a political goal for different people in Iran. If you look at the numbers, and I know that politics is about more than trade and investment and overseas communities, but China's interests in the Gulf vastly and overwhelmingly favor the Arab side of the Gulf. They have a very vibrant business community in Dubai. They do a lot of trade and investment that dwarfs what they do with Iran. These projects with GCC countries link to other GCC countries and link to other regional countries and extra regional countries. And the Belt and Road is primarily a project that links people and markets. Iran links to almost nothing despite its geographical benefits. I mean, it's an isolated country in its own region with very few allies or partners of any use. So I think what China sees in Iran is an opportunity to build leverage in its bigger relationship with the US. I don't think, when people talked about this partnership with China and Iran, that was initially signed in 2016, about 4 days after Xi Jinping signed a similar deal with Saudi Arabia. Now, I think it's telling that within months, the Saudi-China Comprehensive Strategic Partnership was operationalized. They both appointed very high-level senior government officials to lead the relationship. And there's been tens, if not hundreds of billions of dollars in deals, MOUs, and investment contracts signed. It's been operating at a very high level now, going on 6 years. In 2018, they signed a similar one with the UAE. And again, almost immediately it was operationalized, and it got to such a deep level that they're cooperating on COVID and vaccines and port investment and all sorts of important things. With Iran, 6 years later, they're still at the implementation stage. I think what happened, the reason why they signed this deal, why they finally got it done last March, and then why they invited Iran to apply for full membership of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization last August, I think that was China offering incentives to Iran to get in line and come back to the JCPOA in an honest way, because you can't benefit from the partnership if you're under sanctions. There's only one Chinese financial institute that operates in Iran, and it does almost nothing because of sanctions. So, what China would get out of the partnership and what it would get out of joining the SCO is a chance to develop its economy and to engage with those countries in energy exports and all sorts of really important things. But if it doesn't return to the JCPOA and remains under sanctions, nothing happens. So I think these are carrots, because China's preference in the Gulf especially is for regional stability. They're not a revisionist actor. They don't want to upend the region. They get too much business in the region to want to change anything. I think what they want is for Iran to stop acting like a destabilizing actor. So much like they did when they offered Iran this partnership deal in 2016, right after the JCPOA was signed, they said, look, this is what you get for good behavior, but it's not a secret. Like, Trump was elected president a few months later on a very strong, his only foreign policy objectives was, I don't like China and I don't like the Iran deal. So China almost immediately pulled back from all of the engagement with Iran. You saw very little happening there. And under maximum pressure, China complied. So I think what they're saying to Iran right now is, look, here's the path towards you guys getting what you need if you can go to the JCPOA and stop being a troublesome actor in a very strategically important region. I don't think China favors Iran over the UAE or Saudi. I think they probably look at it as a bit of a nuisance, but a really good bargaining chip that they can build up as leverage in their relationship with the US.
Thanks, Jonathan. I think that's a really important counteractive to a lot of the, as you were saying, overheated talk about where China-Iran relationship is going. Xiaojin or Lina, did you have anything to add on that? No? Okay. We have time for perhaps one more question, and we have one from the audience about what is the state of relations between China and Israel, Palestine. It's a pretty big question, but maybe just briefly, we've seen, China has, as the question suggests, pretty strong economic ties with Israel, has been occasionally getting involved in trying to kind of portray itself as going to play a role in the Middle East peace process or putting forward some proposals. So just curious, if anyone has thoughts on where China's relationship with those two parties is going, and China's diplomatic engagement on that critical issue.
Yeah, I can jump in a little bit, so you two can add anything. I was shocked when I read the news the other day that this Haifa port in Israel actually opened and start operating. So because there's a lot of media report that, because Israel being a very strong ally of USA, and if USA are not okay with that Haifa port, which is very close to an American Navy base in Israel somehow, so that wouldn't, that shouldn't happen, or we have some twist or some delay, but that actually happened. So I have this understanding now that it's really actually can have its relatively independent foreign policy. It doesn't have to be always in coordination with USA and tell, okay, whatever USA says, okay, do not deal with China, do not do this with China, USA will comply. I think Israel has independent foreign policy. So that's what China wants to deal with. China has always done, has two worries. Israel is too close with USA, or if China goes too close to Israel, and then maybe there's some discontent from Arab nations, Muslim nations. But now Abraham Accord has signed, And if there's no issues between USA and Israel in terms of China, then China, I think, feel free to deal with Israel in more areas. So the area I'm seeing, like technology cooperation, actually is moving ahead now. And with China and Israel will celebrate 30 years anniversary of diplomatic relations. So I think we will see growing ties between the two nations, despite US factor.
Jonathan, Lina, any final words on that before we wrap?
I think Xiaojun nailed it.
Okay, great. Well, we are at time. I want to thank Jonathan, thank Lina and Xiaojun for a great discussion on what is obviously a really critical topic. So, I would encourage everyone to go out and buy the book, or at least encourage the professors in your life to assign it and ensure it's in the reference desks, stacks. The Atlantic Council will obviously be continuing to expand work on the China Middle East issue. I want to flag that Jonathan has also just launched a new monthly China Middle East podcast where he's going to go deep with experts about all facets of China-MENA relations. And as we just demonstrated here, there is a lot to get to. So highly recommend checking that out. So thanks again to the panel. Thank you to everyone for joining us today, and have a good rest of your day.
Thanks so much.
Thank
everyone.
you.